I said I needed time. That was 3 weeks ago, and yet here I was, leaning against the counter of a dusty little bookstore on the edge of town, pretending I was just browsing. I wasn't. I was waiting, not sure for what exactly, only that I couldn't stop myself. She was behind the register, sorting through a pile of returned books with that quiet authority that made everyone else in the store feel like they didn't exist. Mid-40s, maybe a little older than that, with dark hair streaked just enough with silver to make it striking rather than tired. Her glasses slid down her nose as she frowned at a receipt, and for a moment I thought I could see every little calculation and worry she carried like invisible weights. She didn't notice me, not yet, but I noticed everything. I had never been good at this, being around her without saying something foolish. My heart thumped harder than it should for someone who wasn't even sure they were allowed to feel this way. I shifted, the soles of my sneakers squeaking on the linoleum, and she looked up, startled, eyes catching mine for just a second before she smiled politely and returned to her work. That smile, it wasn't wide, not really, but it made the corners of her eyes crinkle in a way that made me forget how to breathe. I wandered down the aisles, fingering the spines, pretending to examine a book I had no intention of reading. Her presence filled the room, and I caught her glance every so often when she thought I wasn't looking. Each time our eyes met, there was this tiny flicker of something, recognition, curiosity, maybe even a little tension. And then she'd look away, back to the mundane task of scanning barcodes, and the electricity would linger, unspoken. She walked past me once, close enough that I could smell the faint scent of coffee and citrus on her, and my stomach tightened. She didn't touch me, didn't brush against me. God, she didn't have to. But the air between us seemed to pulse, just slightly, and I wondered if she even felt it. I wanted to say something, anything, but my words stuck like iron in my throat. Then she did something small, but impossibly human. A paperback had slipped from the top of the stack and teetered on the edge of the counter. Without a word, she caught it, her fingers brushing mine for a fraction of a second. I jerked back, not sure if I had imagined it, but she just adjusted the book and tucked it neatly on the shelf. Nothing had been said, yet the silence between us felt louder than any conversation could be. I went to the coffee cart she kept by the register, her little concession to people who lingered too long, and bought a latte, not because I wanted it, but because I wanted an excuse to stay. I watched her as she leaned on the counter, flipping through a notebook with notes I couldn't read, lips pressed together, concentrating. She seemed untouchable and infinitely familiar all at once, like someone I should know better but didn't. And then, just as I was thinking maybe I had imagined the tiny spark between us, she looked up, caught my gaze, and for a long second, I could have sworn she was measuring me. Not judging, not smiling, not frowning, just seeing me. Really seeing me. My chest ached in a way I couldn't name, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. I left the store 10 minutes later, pretending I had errands to run, but the image of her hands, so calm, so deliberate, brushing against mine for the briefest moment, followed me out into the crisp afternoon. And for the first time in a long time, I wondered if taking time was something I could actually do, or if it was already too late. Even now, hours later, I keep seeing that flicker in her eyes, that imperceptible weight of attention, and I can't stop thinking about it. The repair shop smelled of motor oil and old metal, but somehow it felt warmer than the bookstore had. I wasn't supposed to be here, really. I was only helping her move a broken filing cabinet from the back office. But once I stepped inside, I understood why she'd agreed so easily. She had that way of making spaces feel alive, even when they were cluttered and dusty. She was crouched down, sliding the cabinet toward the wall, hair pulled back in a loose knot, strands falling across her forehead. Her hands, the same ones that had brushed mine in the bookstore, were precise and strong, but I noticed a faint tremor when she shifted her weight. She tried to hide it behind a quick shake of her wrist, but I caught it. She always tried to keep everything in check, like the world might crumble if she let herself falter. "Need a hand?" I asked, careful not to sound too eager. She paused, fingers gripping the edge of the cabinet, and gave a tight smile. "I've got it." Her voice was firm, but not unkind. I could hear the faintest edge of exhaustion, like she'd been holding back for hours. I stepped closer anyway, offering support without saying a word. She hesitated, then exhaled, allowing me to help lift the cabinet just enough for her to slide it into place. Her body relaxed ever so slightly against mine, and I felt it. This quiet, almost forbidden energy that pulsed between us whenever we were this close. "You're stronger than you look," I said, trying to break the tension. Her lips twitched, almost a laugh, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I've had to be." There was a pause, and then she muttered something I couldn't catch, a self-deprecating shrug that made her look simultaneously guarded and fragile. I wanted to ask her to repeat it, but I didn't. I didn't need words. I already understood something about her that no one else ever seemed to notice. I watched her hands as she wiped sweat from her brow, saw the faint scar along her knuckle, the way her fingers flexed instinctively before letting go of the cabinet. I noticed the small details she tried to ignore, the crease in her forehead, the tired slump in her shoulders, the way she tried to mask her sigh behind a cough. Every little imperfection made her feel more real, more alive, more impossible to approach. And yet, despite all the barriers she'd built, there was a softness in her gaze that flickered toward me when she thought I wasn't looking. A vulnerability that she tried to hide, but couldn't completely. It was a quiet invitation wrapped in steel, dangerous, confusing, irresistible. As the cabinet settled into its final place, our hands brushed again, brief but deliberate this time. She didn't pull away immediately. Her eyes lingered on mine, and I felt my chest tighten, the familiar ache of wanting something I wasn't supposed to have. She exhaled slowly, a sound almost like a sigh or a question, and I realized she was letting me see this small crack in her armor. For just a heartbeat, the world contracted to the space between us, a silent acknowledgement of something neither of us had the courage to name. And then, without a word, she stepped back, wiping her hands on her jeans, and looked away, but I knew. I knew she felt it too. That flicker, that pull, that impossible charge that made everything else in the room fade. I couldn't stop thinking about the way her fingers had lingered, just slightly, on mine. The office was quiet, the kind of quiet that made every creak of the radiator and every distant car horn feel louder than it should. Rain tapped insistently against the windows, a soft but relentless rhythm that made the fluorescent lights above us seem harsh and sterile. I was leaning against the corner of her desk, ostensibly organizing files, but mostly just watching her. She had kicked off her heels, crossed one leg over the other, and was scrolling through her tablet with that same intensity one had seen 1,000 times before. But tonight, something about her made the air feel electric. She glanced up at me once, just a flicker of acknowledgement, and then back down. I could see the small crease between her eyebrows, the faint redness around her eyes, and I wondered what kind of day had brought her here, alone, at this hour. Her fingers drummed lightly on the edge of the desk, almost like a secret Morse code she didn't intend for me to read. "I thought you left hours ago," she said finally, voice low, guarded. "I had errands," I muttered, unsure why my own words felt inadequate. There was a pause, and then she looked at me properly, really looked, as if weighing whether I was a stranger or someone she might let in. And God, I wanted to tell her everything, to confess that I hadn't left the bookstore because I hadn't wanted to, that I hadn't left this office because I didn't want to be anywhere else, but I didn't. My chest tightened, and I swallowed the words. They would ruin this fragile balance between us. She laughed softly at something on the tablet, and it was just a tiny sound, almost swallowed by the storm outside, but it made my stomach twist. It wasn't flirtatious, it wasn't intentional, but it was entirely hers, and entirely devastating. Then her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, her expression tightening ever so slightly. I didn't need to see the screen to guess. It was probably him, the name that always seemed to hang in the air, unspoken, whenever she let herself relax too much around me. She sighed, a short, resigned sound, and I felt a sharp pang in my chest, part guilt, part longing. I wanted to move closer. I wanted to bridge that tiny space between us and tell her, without words, that I had been waiting, that I wanted her in ways she couldn't yet name. I lifted my hand, almost, just a fraction, just to brush a stray hair from her cheek, but then the phone lit up again, and she shifted, guarded once more. The moment passed before it fully existed. We settled back into the quiet, her fingers tracing idle patterns on the desk, mine pressed loosely against my thigh. The storm outside grew louder, a muted reminder that time moved forward whether we acted or not. I wanted to reach for her, but I didn't. Every instinct in me screamed that it was the wrong thing to do. Yet everything else, every heartbeat and unspoken glance, told me it was exactly the right moment. She stood suddenly, gathering her things, and I realized the storm, the office, the tension. It had been leading somewhere I wasn't allowed to go. I stayed put, breath shallow, fingers itching to close the distance that would never be crossed. And as she walked past me, the scent of her coat lingering in the air, I thought, one more step, just one, and I would have. I found her in the small courtyard behind the hotel, the late afternoon sun muted behind gray clouds. The air was heavy, damp from a drizzle that had passed, and the faint smell of wet stone made everything feel colder than it was. She was sitting on the edge of a fountain, hands clasped around her knees, staring at the rippling water without really seeing it. I hesitated. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words tangled in my throat. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy, as if the space itself knew we couldn't keep pretending. "You've been distant," I said finally, voice quieter than I intended. My words seemed intrusive, too loud, echoing in the empty courtyard. She didn't answer immediately. Her eyes stayed fixed on the water, and for a moment, I thought she might not. Then she let out a sigh, long and weary, and finally spoke. "I don't know. I don't even know what this is anymore." Her confession landed in my chest like a stone. Not like a shock. I had felt it coming, had been circling it for weeks, but still, it hurt. The words weren't romantic, not in the way I wanted, but they were real, honest. She was admitting that the equilibrium between us had shifted, that we could no longer ignore it. I can't pretend I'm not thinking about you all the time," I admitted, almost a whisper. My fingers flexed at my sides. And I know I shouldn't. Her shoulders tightened slightly. She shifted, brushing damp strands of hair from her face, and for a moment, the only movement was the subtle quiver of her fingers. "It's not just that," she said slowly. "I feel exposed, vulnerable, and I hate that I do." I moved closer, careful not to cross her boundaries, careful not to destroy the fragile balance we had left. "I don't want to hurt you," I said. And it was true. I wanted nothing more than to protect her, even if it meant my own heart ached in silence. She finally looked up, meeting my gaze. Her eyes were raw, wide, something like fear or maybe longing, I couldn't tell. And yet, she trailed off. She shook her head as if to clear the thought, as if acknowledging it was dangerous even to say it aloud. The courtyard was quiet except for the trickle of water and the distant hum of traffic. Time stretched, measured only by the steady pulse of our breaths, and I realized that in all my careful observation, I had never seen her like this, completely unguarded and entirely human. "I don't know what to do with this," she admitted finally, voice trembling almost imperceptibly. "I don't know what we are. I don't know if I can, if I should." Her words hovered in the air, unfinished, like a question with no answer. I wanted to reach for her, wanted to erase the confusion and fear in her eyes, but I stayed still. I didn't want to ruin the raw honesty of the moment. She looked away, staring at the fountain again, and I could feel her walls closing back up, slow but inevitable. My chest ached, not with desire, not yet, but with the weight of everything we couldn't name. And then she whispered, almost to herself, almost as a surrender, "I think I'm terrified of losing myself in this, and maybe I already have." I had dropped by her apartment under the pretense of returning a book she'd lent me. The place smelled faintly of vanilla and old paper, that strange combination that made it feel lived in and intimate without trying. She was on the sofa, knees pulled up, flicking through an old photo album she'd left open. "You're not supposed to see these," she said softly, but she didn't close it. Her voice held no accusation, just a quiet weight, like the memories themselves were heavy. I crouched beside her, careful to give her space, but drawn to the images anyway. There were pictures of her younger self, laughing with a man I didn't know, holding hands, carefree in a way I could barely imagine her being. My stomach nodded. "That was a long time ago," she said, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the wall, on some invisible horizon. Her fingers trembled slightly as she turned the pages. I thought I'd moved on. I thought I had. I wanted to say something, anything, but I couldn't. I just watched, noticing the tiny micro-movements, the way her lips pressed together, the slight catch in her breath, the subtle tension in her shoulders. Each detail made me ache with longing I hadn't tried to name before. "Who did you lose?" I asked finally, voice low, careful. She glanced at me, startled, as if she hadn't expected me to speak, as if the question itself was dangerous. Then she nodded toward a folded envelope tucked between the pages. This was his last letter to me. She hesitated, then slid it toward me, fingers brushing mine. I felt the faint warmth linger long after our contact ended. I unfolded the paper, trying to keep my voice steady. The words weren't long, just fragments of apologies and love, a messy human attempt to hold on to something slipping away. I could hear her inhale sharply beside me, small but sharp, like a silent confession. "I was young," she said after a long pause, almost as if talking to herself. "And I thought I could fix things. But some things, some people, they don't wait." Her hands shook as she closed the photo album gently. "I've carried it for so long. I didn't even realize I was still carrying it." I reached out, almost instinctively, placing my hand near hers on the armrest. She didn't pull away, didn't move toward me either. It was a quiet acknowledgement of shared space, a recognition that we were both human, flawed, fragile. You're still allowed to feel that," I said softly, voice catching on the edges. "Even now." She looked at me then, really looked, and there was something there I hadn't seen before, a fracture, a vulnerability, but also a tiny, unexpected trust. Her lips parted slightly, but she didn't speak. And then, almost imperceptibly, she leaned closer, not enough for comfort, not enough for warmth, but enough for the air between us to shift. My chest tightened. I wanted to reach further, to close the gap, but I stayed still. For a heartbeat, everything in the room paused. The rain outside, the soft hum of the city, the weight of old grief. And in that silence, I realized something seismic had happened. She didn't say it aloud, but her eyes, fragile and human and aching, told me everything I needed to know. She was letting me in. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets outside wet and glistening under the streetlights. I walked with her to the small cafe she liked, the one tucked into a corner of the city that smelled of coffee and old wood. We didn't speak much, just the occasional quiet comment about the steam rising from our cups, the low hum of conversation around us. She slid her hands around her mug, fingers brushing the ceramic, and I noticed how tense her shoulders had been earlier, how slowly they were easing. The ordinary motion was somehow intimate. Her presence, quiet and unguarded, was enough. I keep thinking about the letter," I said softly, trying not to break the fragile balance between us. She looked down, lips pressed together, then exhaled slowly. "I know. I haven't been able to stop thinking either." Her voice was low, even, but there was a tremor I could feel in the air. It wasn't dramatic, wasn't meant to be, but it carried the weight of years she'd been carrying alone. I didn't say anything for a while. I just watched her, noting the subtle movements, the way her fingers flexed around the mug, the faint lines of fatigue under her eyes, the tiny smile that came when she caught me watching. Everything about her made my chest tighten, not with grand declarations, not with fireworks, but with the quiet inevitability of feeling that couldn't be undone. She finally met my gaze, eyes soft but searching. "I don't know what this us should look like," she admitted. "Neither do I," I whispered, and the words felt like a relief. No pressure, no expectations, just acknowledgement. That was enough. We sat there in silence for a long stretch, letting the ordinary sounds of the cafe fill the space, letting the world outside exist without dragging us with it. And slowly, Almost imperceptibly, we leaned closer. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just a little, until our knees brushed, until the warmth between us was more than coincidence. She laughed quietly at something a couple at the next table said, and I noticed how it echoed the first laugh I'd ever heard from her, the one in the repair shop, in the bookstore, in moments I hadn't realized I'd been storing in my memory. I reached out slowly, testing the air, and my hand touched hers, not demanding, not urgent, just a simple, grounding contact. Her fingers didn't pull away. They curled slightly around mine, tentative, fragile, but enough. Enough to anchor the moment. We didn't speak again for a long while. Words weren't necessary. The space between us was full, not empty. The tension that had hovered for weeks, months, felt like it had settled into something quieter, something earned. When she leaned back, her hand still lightly resting on mine, I realized I could breathe again. The future was unknown, messy, unpredictable, but for now, in this small, ordinary cafe, it was enough. And I knew, without a single declaration, without promises or plans, that we had crossed into something neither of us could ignore. I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling her warmth beside me, and in that quiet, imperfect, human moment, it felt final. It's been months since that night in the cafe, the night we stopped pretending. I still walk past the streets, past the little bookstores and cafés, and sometimes I think I can feel the echo of that first spark, the tension that made every glance feel like a secret. But it's different now. Softer. Less desperate. She's changed too, though she wouldn't admit it. There's a lightness in her step, a quiet patience in her eyes, the kind that comes from letting someone in without losing yourself. I see it in the small things. How she laughs more easily. How she pauses to notice the way the sunlight falls on a windowsill. How she sometimes just looks at me and smiles without a word. I've changed in ways I didn't expect. I've learned that love doesn't always need to explode or declare itself. Sometimes it's a touch, a shared glance, a silence that feels full. I've learned to wait, to notice, to be present, not just for her, but for myself. That ache I used to feel in my chest when I wanted something I couldn't have has softened into something warmer. Appreciation, understanding, a quiet joy in simply existing together. We still have our moments of hesitation, of awkwardness, of those silent questions about the future. But now, when I see her hesitation, I don't panic. I stay beside her. I offer my hand, my presence, my attention. And she does the same, not out of obligation, but because we've chosen it, moment by moment. Sometimes, when we're sitting across from each other in a quiet room, I catch her staring at me, just a fraction longer than necessary, and I feel that old spark, but without the confusion, without the fear. It's recognition now, not longing. Comfort now, not obsession. We've crossed the distance that once made everything feel impossible. It's funny how small things can become monumental. The brush of a hand across mine as I reach for my coffee, the faint smile when I pass her on the street, the unspoken agreement that even in silence, we're together. None of it is perfect. None of it is dramatic. And yet, somehow it's enough. I realize now that love doesn't always need a declaration. Sometimes it's in the lingering touches, the patience, the moments when two flawed people simply choose to remain present for each other. That's what I've learned. That's what she's taught me. And as I stand on the balcony, watching the city lights flicker against the darkening sky, I feel her hand slip into mine, not forcefully, not hurriedly, just naturally, and I squeeze gently. It's a reminder that we've arrived somewhere real, somewhere human, somewhere worth holding on to. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this? And for now, I let the silence settle between us, warm and full, and I know that some things, love, understanding, connection, don't need to be shouted to be true.